I'd like to thank you all again. We're going to take and now move into our second panel. The second panel focuses on fossil fuels, so condensate LNG. We're very fortunate to have another distinguished panel here to discuss this issue. We will take, and just in the interest of time, I'll be very brief. As I mentioned earlier, you all have the bios. And we'll go in the following order. We are fortunate to have Deputy Assistant Secretary Matthew Baume here from the U.S. Department of Commerce for Export Administration, and he will kick things off in just a moment. He will then be followed by June Kim, who is the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Planning for SK Energy. He will then be followed by Graham Dodds, who's the President of ExxonMobil Korea. And after him will be Mr. Homyu Lee, who is the head of gas policy and the research division for the Korea Energy Economics Institute. And then after all of them provide their presentation, Dr. Hee-Jip Kim will come back up and will moderate the panel discussion from there. Thank you very much. Das Baume.
Good. Thank you, Troy. If you don't mind, it's a small room. I think I'll just stay down here. Hopefully keep everybody's attention a little bit more than if I stand up at the podium. As you heard Troy say, I'm Matt Baume, and I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Export Administration and Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security. So just to make sure everybody's on the same page, the reason I'm here is because in the U.S. system, our Bureau, the Bureau of Industry and Security, is responsible for most but not all of U.S. export controls, and that includes implementing the U.S. domestic restrictions on the export of crude oil. So as probably most of you know, we have a number of laws in the United States that essentially prohibit, with certain exceptions, the export of crude oil from the United States. And of course, those go back to the mid-1970s and the time of the Arab oil embargo. And the principal laws that govern this are the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, EPCA, the Mineral Lands Leasing Act, or MLA, and the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. And then there's some other laws as well, but those are the three principal ones. So since the 1970s, we and our regulations, the Export Administration regulations, have had a section that deals with crude oil and crude oil exports. So the first thing to know is that we do have a definition of crude oil. And it's just liquid, essentially liquid hydrocarbons that come out of the ground. And then we have some specific examples. The most prominent one probably is least condensate. And then we go on to say in our definition of crude oil, once those liquid hydrocarbons have been processed through a crude oil distillation tower, they're no longer crude from an export control viewpoint. And so what that means is they are subject to very few export restrictions. So in our world, it's either crude, and it's subject to significant restrictions from an export viewpoint, or it's petroleum product, and it's subject to very few restrictions. And to help exporters understand the difference, in our supplement, we have the Schedule B numbers, the harmonized tariff code numbers, 2709, with all the sub-paragraphs that lay out what's crude from an export classification viewpoint and what's product. But again, from our viewpoint, from an export control viewpoint, the critical issue is, has the crude oil been processed through a crude oil distillation tower? How many of you have seen the press over the last year on the issue of commodity classifications? A couple of these, yeah, all right. So that's when a company comes into us and says, in this case, here's our process for processing crude oil. And at the end of that, we look at it, we at Commerce, and say, you have shown us that you have run your crude oil through a crude oil distillation tower. That's the cut line for crude versus product. And then we give them a commodity classification. The press often refers to these as private rulings. We don't have private rulings. They're commodity classifications, which are business confidential. And then it's classified as EAR 99 under our regulations as petroleum product. It can go almost anywhere in the world without restriction. But if they haven't processed it through a distillation tower, say it's just been run through a flash drum or a heater treater, that's still crude oil, and again, subject to the restrictions. So that's the first issue, is the thing crude oil? If it's not, people can export almost without restriction. If it is crude oil, we still have the authority to issue licenses or allow the export of crude oil in certain circumstances. So now I'm going to take a step back for a minute. So remember, we have the laws that restrict the export of crude oil. all of those laws have some sort of exceptions to the restrictions in them. In EPCA, the principal exception is essentially the president's authority to have a national interest finding that certain classes of crude oil exports, otherwise restricted, are in the national interest. So over the last several decades, there have been several presidential findings that have authorized classes of crude oil exports, notwithstanding the prohibition. The most significant one were the ones that were done in the 1980s by President Reagan that allowed us to license on a transaction-by-transaction basis the export of crude oil from the US to Canada for consumption or use in Canada. And so over the last couple of years, we've been doing more than 100 licenses every year for the exports of US crude to Canada for consumption or use in Canada under those national interest findings which carved them out of the statutory prohibition on exports. Another statutory prohibition that was actually implemented by presidential finding was for the export of Alaska North Slope oil over the Trans-Alaskan pipeline. That was done by President Clinton in the 1990s. So those are reflected in our regulations. In addition to that, we have authority under the Mineral Leasing Act to authorize the exchange in similar quantity of crude oil with an adjacent foreign state. So that's another avenue that crude oil can be exported. It has to be crude for crude, and it has to be with an adjacent foreign state. So someone can come in and apply for a license and say, I would like the authorization to export my crude for a similar quantity of foreign crude from an adjacent foreign state. If you want to export your crude to a non-adjacent foreign state, such as Korea, then there's a different set of criteria that the applicant has to meet. They have to show that if they want to export crude for crude, what will come back into the United States is equal or better quantity and quality than what's going out, and that there are compelling economic or technological reasons that crude that they want to export cannot reasonably be marketed in the United States. That's the regulatory standard. They also have to show that a contract for such an exchange can be terminated if there's a supply disruption. So from an applicant's point of view, that is the easiest prong, because you just write a contract clause. The other two are more challenging to meet. You can also look to export crude for product, and it's essentially the same standard. You have to show that the product coming back in is equal or better quantity and quality than you get if you refine the crude you want to export in the United States. So you can see, if you take a step back from all of these specific requirements, the policy behind this is the U.S. should be made at least whole, if not better, by any allowed crude exports of crude oil. Because again, this goes back to the 1970s when there was an Arab oil embargo and our crude oil production was declining. The challenge for us now, of course, is those regulations were written 30 to 40 years ago. And we have an entirely different situation in the United States today, which is this dramatic increase in the production of U.S. crude. And in particular, most of it is much lighter than what had historically been produced. And of course, what refiners over the last 2 decades had been configuring their refineries to process. So I'm sure you've all seen there have been any number of studies, as well as all sorts of articles on this, that you have this significant mismatch between that dramatic increase in U.S. oil production at the condensate or light API levels and the bulk of U.S. refining capacity, particularly in the Gulf, which is really configured primarily for processing really heavier crude, either from Venezuela, Mexico, Saudi. So that's what we're grappling with right now. The last thing I want to do to emphasize, and then we'll move on to the next speaker, is our commodity classifications that we have issued that have been reported in the press do not represent a change in policy. What they represent is applying the regulations that have been in place for 40 years with a new factual circumstance. Even 3 years ago, nobody was coming in and talking to us about crude oil. It's really only been within the last 2 years where people have been coming into us pretty frequently and talking to us either about, is my process enough to move it from crude to product and therefore easy to export? Or if I know it's crude, but I have this mismatch between the refining capacity of the United States and what my crude is, whether it's Eagle Ford or Bakken or Permian Basin, what do I need to show to be able to get a license to export it to a foreign destination? So that's really what I wanted to say. I'll stop at this point. We'll go on to the next speaker. But as Troy said, when we're finished, we're happy to take questions. Thank you.
I'll change my glasses. Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Baume, for your kind explanation on the criteria for exporting crude oil and condensate. And I'm grateful to the KEEI for hosting this conference. And I'd like to deliver my sincere gratitude to Second Vice Minister Jae Moon for giving me this valuable chance to discuss the US and Korea collaboration in condensate trading. People, distinguished policymakers and business leaders of both countries. If I may, firstly, I would like to give you an overview of the global and Korean condensate market situation. Global condensate production has increased dramatically at an average annual growth rate of 9%, from 3.5 million barrels per day in 2008 to 5.9 million barrels in 2014, as a consequence of increased demand for and production of natural gas. To utilize this increasing condensate supply, new condensate splitters have been constructed in the Middle East and Asia, including Korea. We, Korean oil and petrochemical companies, have invested in condensate splitters while increasing the production of paraxylene in order to capture a greater share in the PX market, especially in China. In 2008, in Korea, only one condensate splitter was operating at a capacity of 80,000 barrels per day. However, the total capacity of condensate splitters in Korea will be 515,000 barrels per day by the end of 2017. So competition in the region to secure condensate has been gradually heating up. Condensate imports to Korea have been increasing dramatically at an average annual growth rate of 17%. The total volume of condensate imports in Korea almost doubled up for 5 years. In 2014, 60% of total condensate was imported from one specific country, that is Qatar. This is why Korea is so keen to diversify the sources of its condensate. And secondly, I'd like to point out the brand war issue in the US. The quantity of condensate produced in the US has been increasing thanks to the shale renaissance. This means the total volume of imported crude oil, especially light and ultralight oils into the US, is decreasing. The total volume of imported crude oil reduced by 22% from 9.5 million barrels per day in 2010 to 7.4 million barrels per day in 2014. US refiners are also constructing condensate splitters to exploit this new environment. However, I think constructing splitters in the US would be a limited countermeasure to cope with increasing condensate supply in the US. US oil demand is stagnant at only about 1% per year, and US refineries are limited in their capacity to process condensate because they are operating too many cokers. The total capacity of cokers in North America is bigger than that of the the countries in the world. Cokers are suitable only for refining ultra-heavy oils like Canadian oil sands or Venezuelan crude. This mismatch between feedstock and equipment is what is known in the industry as a blend war. This situation has some organizations predicting that the US will have to export anywhere from 320,000 barrels per day. This is IEA forecast. To 1 million barrels per day, this is Platts forecast. Of its surplus condensate in 2020. Eventually, the ban on condensate and crude oil exports will raise an outlet sustainability issue for the US oil and gas industry. This leads to US crude being sold at a price structurally lower than Brent and Dubai. Next, I'd like to discuss trade issues of the US with other countries. The volume of US trade with Korea has been increasing. It reached $115 billion in 2014. It was $90 billion in 2010. Please look at the table below. This table shows the ratio of trade imbalance as a proportion of total trade volume between the US and each specific countries. Absolutely, China ranks number one. The volume of US trade with China is $591 billion in 2014. The amount of trade deficit of the US against China was $343 billion. So the ratio of trade imbalance between these two countries was 58%. Korea is the sixth highest among all of US bilateral trade relationships. And US total trade volume in 2014 was almost $4,000 billion, and the amount of deficit was $722 billion. This means the ratio of trade imbalance of the US in 2014 is on the average 18%. In my opinion, new items for trade, such as condensate, could reduce the trade imbalance of the US and enhance economic cooperation with other countries. Now, I'd like to close my presentation with a wrap-up and some suggestions for US policymakers and business leaders. From the Korean perspective, the Korean oil industry is hoping to import condensate from the US in order to diversify our feedstock sources and provide energy security and a stable feedstock supply to the petrochemical industry in Korea. From the US perspective, exporting US condensate and crude oil will reduce fuel price in the US, boost US industrial activity, provide more jobs, and expedite the US economic recovery. It will also reduce the trade imbalance with other countries. I would kindly request you to take note of recent studies by respective institutions, such as Brookings, IHS, etc. Finally, my suggestion is that the US should allow condensate exports to a limited region, i.e., to FTA countries such as Korea, to verify the economic benefits from such exportation. And after that, the US could gradually and smoothly lift its ban on the exportation of US crude oil. Thank you very much for your time. Next.
Okay, well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First up, I'm going to do something really unusual here today. I'm going to be an ExxonMobil formal speech to you, but no PowerPoint slides, and that's unusual for an ExxonMobil talk. First up, great to see those of you who have stayed this afternoon, and for those of you who are from Korea, glad to see that you're still awake, and I hope that after my session you'll still be awake. I'd like to thank the Korea Economic Institute for putting this on and for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about some views on the LNG world. When it comes to tackling the important challenge of supplying the world's growing energy needs while reducing our environmental footprint, the gas industry has become crucial. Nowhere is this more evident than right here in the United States, where the abundant and reliable supplies have unlocked the growth in the unconventional developments, and they've been instrumental in bringing extraordinary economic benefits while reducing America's carbon dioxide emissions to levels not seen since the 1990s. I, for one, am very proud and pleased to see that the achievements of our industry are becoming better appreciated, and more policymakers now understand the important role that natural gas will play in our future. And I have to say that the contribution of Korea to this energy challenge has also been pivotal, both as one of the pioneering buyers of LNG, and I'm pleased that ExxonMobil was a partner with Korea when it first entered into the LNG business back in 1986. But Korea has done a lot in the last recent years with construction and fabrication of oil and gas processing facilities, drilling modules, LNG ships for projects across the globe. And again, I'm very pleased to say that ExxonMobil has built a lot of its projects in Korea, and we continue to do that today. As an industry, we've certainly achieved a great deal in recent years, but today I want to focus on where we go to from here, because the expectation for the gas industry are increasing dramatically. And right now, we're at a tipping point of sorts, where low product prices, coupled with the rising development costs, put pressure on the industry's ability to progress the projects needed to meet market demand post-2020. Our energy outlook, and that outlook is available on our website if you want to go and take a look at that, shows that global gas demand growing at a rate of about 2.5% per year between 2010 and 2025. So to put this in perspective, it means that the amount of incremental gas needed to meet global demand by 2025 will be almost double the size of the entire US gas market today, and that's a large market. Of that demand, we anticipate that nearly 75% will come to Asia-Pacific countries, including Korea, where we will see demand nearly doubling between today and 2025 that will then make the Asia-Pacific the largest gas market in the world. We also expect LNG to assume a growing share of the world's gas demand. Most of this demand for LNG comes from existing as well as emerging markets in the Asia-Pacific as well as the Middle East. Happily, we live in an age of increasing natural gas supplies, thanks in large part to the technology that unlocks new resources, both conventional and unconventional. As such, the industry can indeed meet the world's increased demand, but the challenge lies in developing these supplies fast enough to keep up with the growing demand. Underlying supply will have to grow by nearly 9% per year to keep up with the expected demand, especially when you factor in the decline of existing fields. So based on the facilities currently under construction, the average LNG project size is about 6 million tonnes per year. Assuming that that stays constant, and there's data that suggests that it will, the market will need about 18 more projects to go to FID in the next 5 years in order to meet demand through 2025. And these FIDs need to start happening now. That's because LNG projects take about 5 years to build between FID and start-up, and they're very capital intensive. Plus, on top of that, there's a limited number of qualified contractors and fabrication facilities that are necessary to handle projects of this scale. So right now, given the price environment, there are numerous challenges to delivering projects in the timelines necessary to meet the demand that exists. Developers have less access to capital with which to invest at a time when LNG project costs have escalated to near unprecedented levels. There is uncertainty about the future, and customers are eager to test new and different contracting models. So, with current costs being what they are, most new LNG projects are not competitive in the current price environment. So it's important to remember that while the market has changed rapidly in recent months, as we've seen from prior speakers, oil and gas and LNG as a subset continue to be cyclical industries like all commodities. The industry's been in this position before, and the industry will likely be in this position again. This is not new. Success in our business lies in sound fundamentals, particularly disciplined investment decisions, flawless operations, efficiency and cost management. We hope that this downturn will soon lead to a reduction in costs as competition intensifies amongst contractors and others. We can also look to innovative engineering ways to bend the cost curve, such as modularisation, economies of scale, and excellence in project execution. We can better define, quantify, and mitigate the risks in the execution process by engaging with stakeholders through the value chain early. Nevertheless, it will be difficult for 18 additional projects to go to FID in the current price environment over the next 5 years, especially when you consider all of the key project factors that have got to be synchronised beforehand. This is not straightforward. We will need growing, creditworthy demand, as well as reliable, high-quality supply sources and clearly defined projects that are economically viable. With each project proposal, the most critical component will be a financeable commercial structure. This involves multiple elements, including fiscal terms, permitting, and most importantly, sales secured through a sales and purchase agreement. The buyers, like us sellers, have future price uncertainty. There's no doubt that different contract arrangements will be experimented with over the next few years. These arrangements include tolling agreements, non-source specific portfolio sales, variations on price indexation, and more short-term sales. But regardless of where that goes, and regardless of the contractual arrangements, long-term commitments are still needed from creditworthy buyers to underpin the financing for a project. And these agreements usually take well over a year to put in place before an FID decision can be taken. For buyers, these long-term commitments incentivise new projects and help ensure reliability and security of supply. For developers, to get customers that are willing to sign these long-term commitments, it is crucial that we demonstrate how we can meet the buyer's needs and that we've got the requisite technical and commercial expertise to meet the time frame required and to provide reliability and good customer service during the many long years of operation. I remain very optimistic. In my 30-some-odd years working in this industry, I've seen many of these commodity price cycles, and I've seen how our industry has reacted to it over those many years. There are LNG producers, including ExxonMobil, that view the rapid demand growth as a significant business opportunity. It's difficult to predict how long this particular downturn will last or how prices will settle in the long term. But in our view, if the industry sticks to its fundamentals, the long-term picture for the LNG industry remains bright. Some thoughts from ExxonMobil. I look forward to discussion. Thanks for your attention.
Good afternoon. First of all, on behalf of Korea Energy Economics Institute, an honored co-host of this conference, I'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to KEEI for excellent organization of this seminar, and also to all of you for your participation to this conference. Korea is due to bring its first LNG cargo from the United States in 2 years. Like other Asian LNG importers, Korea regards the United States not as just another big LNG supplier, but as a potential game changer in Asian gas market in the long run. And we expect US LNG will change the game favorable to us. Korea's natural gas demand soared for the last 10 years. It has grown 8% on average every year. That growth rate outpaced all the other energy resources except renewables. Natural gas accounted for 18.7% of total primary energy supply last year. I think I had to update this figure, I'm sorry. Roughly speaking, for several years, Korea got 40% of its energy from oil, 30% from coal, 15 to 20% from natural gas, and the rest from the nuclear and the renewables. Korea's LNG contracts mostly linked their prices to oil price. You can see from the yellow-green line here. Here. The average LNG price marked the oil price hikes just before the financial crisis in 2008. Oops, I'm sorry. 2008, and also the years of over $100 per barrel years from 2011. Well, I wish my country had just 1/10 of U.S. gas reserves, but in reality, we have less than 1/100th of your U.S. gas reserves. Well, we do produce natural gas offshore, but it is less than 1% of our domestic demand, and that gas field will be depleted in several years. So by doing simple arithmetic, we are 99% dependent on foreign gas supply. We imported 37 million tons of LNG last year, which was almost 10% decrease from 2013. It was quite unusual but we can explain it because we had a mild winter and a cool summer last year. So it was quite natural. And KOGAS had hard times to manage their overflowing inventory because of their rigidity of their contracts. I'll touch upon that point later. However, even with reduced import, we had to pay $31.4 billion, and it amounted to 6% of Korea's total import last year. Average import price went above $16 per million BTU. It was really, really painfully high compared to your domestic gas price, like $4 per million BTU. We are second largest LNG importer, but at less than half of Japan. But KOGAS is the single largest buyer in the world and meets 95% of Korean demand. Our natural gas dependency on the Middle East is not as much as that of oil, but it is still as high as 48%. You see here? Can you see it? Okay. 1 out of 3 LNG cargoes bound for Korea comes from Qatar. However, the United States may be the largest source of natural gas in a decade. Even though many LNG contracts are to be newly sealed or renewed up to then, in terms of existing contracts valid in 2027, the United States stands the #1 exporter as of now here. Half of natural gas is burned in the city gas sector, encompassing residential, commercial, industrial use, and small-sized power generation. City gas demand peaks in January and touches bottom in September. So we use gas in January 3 times as much as in September. Usually it is very mild. Well, we have very mild weather in September, and also we have Korean Thanksgiving usually in September. So that's why we burn less gas in September. Since we don't have right geology for underground storage, we had to build many LNG tanks, and we also depends on short-term contracts or spot purchase to manage this tremendous demand seasonality. Turning to the 21st century, power generation led the demand increase. That was because the electricity demand chronically went beyond our expectation. And gas-fired generators played very important role in plugging the gap between the supply and demand of the electricity. But as the demand increase slows down, many gas-fired power stations are idle now. Korea's gas market is unique in that it is monopolized along its supply chain. As I just mentioned, KOGAS imports 90 to 95% of LNG and supplies big power stations and city gas companies. There are a handful of direct importers like the steelmaker POSCO and big energy companies like SK and GS. The government has been trying to open up the gas market and foster competition, but basically direct importers are allowed to do so only for their own use. Local distribution companies get their gas only from KOGAS and sell it only on their tub. Their local monopoly appears very hard now, but in fact they are faced with a very fierce competition with electricity and district heating and waste heat recovery. Oops, sorry. Okay, now let me talk about the US LNG to Korea. LNG from Gulf of Mexico, possibly from Sabine Pass project, is due to arrive at Korean shore in 2 years. The total amount is 5.6 million tons per year. Korea's 5.6 million ton is 11.5% of total capacity of US LNG projects under construction now. That volume will be 13% of total LNG import in 2025, based on the latest Korea Energy Master Plan. And Professor Kim talked about that master plan just in the first session. The US shale boom resonated throughout the world, and Korean companies got interested in it like many others. They made investment in the United States upstream, and some of which are related to LNG projects. And SK ENS, a subsidiary of SK Group, is one of them. Then let me talk about what made Asian buyers so much excited about the US LNG. As you are well aware, first and foremost, it was the price. Our LNG price are indexed to oil via linear equations, and so oil price of $100 per barrel simply means above $15 per million BTU. Although Asian buyers are the biggest among others, we had to pay so-called Asian premium, let alone volume discount. We are paying the highest price, and we are really getting tired of it. For instance, in 2013, Korea paid Qatar, okay, we are talking much about Qatar, we paid Qatar $12 billion only for gas. In other words, we paid every Qatari citizen $45,000 per year only for gas. We contributed much to their wealth. But US LNG prices are indexed to Henry Hub price, and the price has been usually below $4 per million BTU. If this is the case, US LNG is to be delivered at the price of $10 to $11 per million BTU and remains competitive against oil-indexed LNG above $70 to $80 per barrel of Brent. On top of that, US LNG keeps our LNG bill less vulnerable to drastic oil price change. Well, it was a marvelous merit, and we couldn't help but rush to the Gulf of Mexico, Texas, Louisiana. But none of us anticipated oil price could nosedive to below $60 per barrel back then. Regarding the merits of US LNG, many researchers in Asian importing countries, including myself, pay attention to not only to its price, but to its flexibility. Price will vary. Market conditions may drive the US LNG price above $15 per million BTU, or drive it down as low as to $7 per million BTU. But contractual terms, which are attractive to us, won't vary that wild. Most of all, US LNG does not designate where it should land, while typical LNG contracts stipulate unloading ports. That destination clause is to prevent buyers from redirecting cargoes to other buyers without any costs, and to enable suppliers to price discriminate buyers. That rigid term has been so effective that it is regarded as the most significant barrier to trading among East Asian buyers. Take-or-pay is burdensome too. Its intention is to facilitate financing for LNG projects by guaranteeing future revenue. Even if it rarely applies to the whole contracted amount, it could cause real trouble coupled with destination clause. When its LNG storage was all but full last year, KOGAS could neither refuse to take more cargoes nor simply divert them to other buyers. They had to call Japan, Taiwan, and ask them to swap excess cargoes. And KOGAS also had to request suppliers if they could defer summer cargoes to winter. Without Asian markets, we are having this kind of trouble. US LNG helps us diversify our supply sources and makes a very stable source of natural gas. US LNG projects are not tied up with the specific gas reserves, so they are more robust to feed gas supply disruption than traditional LNG projects. Political stability should not be overlooked. Yemen is one of our LNG supplier, but declared the force majeure last January. It was lifted very shortly. It was very good for us, but could have had a huge impact on us because it happened in a very high season. We don't expect, never expect such a situation on the American soil. One of the possible disruption may be operational problem at Panama Canal, but we can handle it somehow. Last but not least, thanks to the free trade agreement, DOE grants approval for export to Korea within a couple of months, while Japanese buyers remained standing in line for years. It does matter for us to beat Japan on every occasion. Thank you. And Asian buyers booked much of LNG capacity in the United States. Japanese utilities and trading companies took more than 17 million tons per year. India, here you can see, India has also shown their willingness to buy US LNG. But more than half of their volume is contracted with the projects which I presume uncertain. But all of our projects are under construction now. Apart from price competitiveness of US LNG, Asian buyers had more reasons to be attracted to it. They are the merits I mentioned just before: flexible terms, the most stable supply source in the world, and so on. In particular, US LNG doesn't impose destination clause on buyers, which saved Asian buyers much of their concerns about overcommitment. It made them a bit more aggressive in securing US LNG capacity. And because we can just sell LNG cargoes to others when our domestic demand is low and our LNG tanks are almost full. Though much more cautious than European utilities, Asian utility buyers can even take advantage of arbitrage opportunities and make money from trading. Sorry. US LNG will definitely add to liquidity in Asian gas market. More LNG cargoes should be ready to flow into East Asia at any time. It will make Pacific and Atlantic basin more synchronized. I cannot go without saying that the United States helps us a lot at negotiating tables with the other suppliers. Buyers' voices are stronger than ever, and we demand more flexibility like the United States offers to us. Asian buyers have shown lukewarm interest to traditional oil-indexed long-term deals, and it is going to be a buyer's market at least for several years. Just as Mr. Todd mentioned, it might cause too little investment in the upstream and call in a tight market again, but it seems buyers got the upper hand now. In the long run, US LNG will make a huge contribution to Asian gas market. Actually, in my personal view, there is nothing we can call Asian gas market now. I hope boosted liquidity and more flexible contractual terms together will kickstart a virtuous cycle and pave a road to a regional market we have been looking forward to for long. As Korean gas markets get mature, there can hardly be a rapid demand growth like before. So new LNG contracts will be replacing older ones. You can see the existing contract amount shrink here around 2024. We have two big contracts with the Qatar and Oman, and they are combined 9 million tons per year. I think the Qatar will likely be interested in keeping supplying us, but Oman will have to respond to their increasing net domestic demand, and they will not be able to extend current long-term deal with us. As always, there is uncertainty in our future gas demand, and it mainly stems from power generation. Natural gas is the most expensive energy source. Even halved LNG price at $8 per million BTU and our new greenhouse gas emission trading scheme don't turn the table. In terms of cost competition, gas cannot beat coal in Korea. Our latest outlook 2 years ago said lots of gas-fired power plants would not be able to find their places in several years. Actually, just I told you, most of them are idling now. We are working on a new outlook, and it will be consistent with our post-2020 greenhouse gas reduction commitments, which is due in the second half of this year. U.S. gas market has its own volatility, and we know it. We know that it swings really wild sometimes. KOGAS has to think about how much of their import could be exposed to Henry Hub price risk. Some say Asian buyers are ready to take US LNG up to 20% of their total import, but it is largely dependent on market conditions when we need a new contract. One sure thing is that the more we have stakes in oil and gas assets in the United States, the more we will buy from the United States. It is needless to say. Our investment in U.S. oil and gas assets also lets us gain valuable experience about the United States gas market and unconventional resources. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, you go first. Thank you. Hi, it has been a very long session, and thank you very much for paying attention to the presentations. But I believe that U.S. and Korean experts, they made wonderful presentations, has a lot of implications and suggestions, and also they showed that it is dynamic environment that we are going through, and Korea has a stable demand, both in condensate and LNG, and could be a good synergy between U.S. and Korea in both in LNG and condensate area. I think we have only short time left, so I think I will just take questions first, and we'll go from there. Does anyone have any question? Okay, Troy?
So, Deputy Assistant Secretary Baume, in your presentation, you talked about how there hadn't really been much movement to export oil up until the last couple of years, and that now you're in a situation where you're applying essentially a new circumstance to regulations that were written, in the 70s. So I guess, maybe sort of a two-part question would be, and I know there's been talk in Congress about maybe loosening the restrictions, everything. Are you actively looking or working and looking to try and make changes that are more reflective of the current situation in terms of the ability of the U.S. to export crudes? And then secondhand, I mean, we know that Korea is interested, but are there other countries as well that are applying pressure or seeking to try and see these changes made? Thank you.
Good. Both good questions. First piece, some of you may have seen the statement by John Podesta back in December before he left the administration. And I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially his answer to a similar question, I think, was they don't anticipate any significant policy changes in this space, other than, for example, the frequently asked questions we issued to clarify how we're going to look at commodity classifications. So that's one piece of it. The other piece, of course, as you know, is there is at least one bill that's been introduced in the House to eliminate the crude oil export ban. And of course, it's entirely unclear what action will or will not be taken on that. As you know, there are folks who have strong different views on this topic, so it's hard to say. For us to revise the regulations, we would really have to go through a proposed rulemaking process and some sort of environmental review, which would be an extremely lengthy, drawn-out process. So as of right now, we're looking to apply the regulations as best we can to the current situation. That's right. So then the second...
Do you get any
And
pressure?
the other countries, that's right. Sorry. We certainly have had interest from some other countries for very similar reasons that you heard our other speakers mention.
Okay.
And, you know, and this reminds me, one other thing that maybe this will anticipate somebody else's questions, which I probably should have mentioned. In our current construct, we don't distinguish between condensate and lower API crude. I mean, that definition of crude oil doesn't have an API or other metric attached to it. We've gotten probably views that the highest market pressure is in condensate because what we've seen over the last few years is, as was mentioned, you've got Brent. Typically, there's a discount from Brent to WTI and LLS, and then a further discount for condensate, because condensate in some ways is undervalued by refiners because they can get less product when they're running it through the heavier, more complex refineries, and it's overpriced as a petchem feedstock, for example, or as a energy source compared to natural gas. Mm-hmm. So from the producer viewpoint, they're really stuck because they get less than they think they should selling it to a domestic refiner, and they would have to discount it even more to sell it to some other non-refinery use in the United States. But we don't distinguish, other than saying least condensate is a type of crude oil, but otherwise we don't distinguish between condensate and crude, in part because, as you can tell, there's no standard definition of what's condensate. It's clearly high light oil, liquid hydrocarbons, but some people say it's at 50, some people say it's 40, 45, 35, so there's no definition.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask two very, hopefully, innocuous questions. And we've got such a distinguished panel that I'm curious, but particularly for Mr. Dodds. There's been a lot of talk, and I don't know how serious it is, about methane hydrate extraction. And I'm just wondering, is there a technology economic ratio that we're waiting for before we hear something about that? And then the second question, either for Mr. Dodds or Deputy Assistant Secretary Borman, the possibility of LNG becoming a global commodity, since we're looking at extraction globally, if this fracking technology unfolds. What's the possibility of that, in your opinion? Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll tackle the hydrates question. I mean, methane hydrates, it's been known for a number of years, presence particularly in the deeper waters in Japan. There has been some experimental extraction work that's been done. I believe, and other panellists might help me here, I believe that last year was the first time that there's successfully been methane hydrates produced at the surface. But clearly it's a technology that's a way down the road for it to become at a commercial scale. But our industry is amazingly innovative, and at the right with the right commercial settings and at the right time, I'm sure the technology will evolve. But it's not there today. On the LNG as global commodity, before Mr. Baume has his go, I would say that if you look at where the LNG industry has been over the last 10 years, it has become a more globalised commodity. But I think you also have to keep it in perspective that LNG, even at the size of the market today, remains a relatively boutique industry in the broader gas industry. So I don't know. Will it become a globally traded commodity? I think a lot depends upon the cost curve, as I mentioned in my remarks, and the ability of the industry to develop projects on an ongoing basis, and that's going to be a function of both cost and price.
The only bit I would add to that is, of course, in our complicated structure, we at Commerce are not responsible for the exports of gas. That's energy. But what I've heard is similar to what Mr. Dodds has said. You know, significantly more capital investment to build an LNG terminal than it is the terminals you'd need to export crude oil, for example. You know, that is a very significant factor, I think. But having said that, you know that there are all sorts of projects around the world that people are at least talking about. And of course, some of that is impacted by the situation in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia.
Okay, thanks. Any other question from the floor? Yes.
Hi, Jane Nakano with CSIS Energy National Security Program. Thank you so much for your presentations. On the topic of LNG or natural gas in general, there seems to be a growing interest among Asian governments and industry players to see some sort of a natural gas trading hub in Asia. The IEA did a wonderful study on this, and there are all these sort of pros and cons associated with each location. You know, there's Singapore as a candidate, China having both the pipeline and you know, LNG imports. You know, that's another candidate. What is sort of a Korean view on this initiative, and then also where does Korea see as its sort of what you know Korea may be able to bring to the table if sort of Asian players are increasingly interested in making this sort of reality? Thank you.
Okay, Homu Lee, would you take the question for us?
I will. Thank you for your wonderful question. Well, that's right. Many Asian countries are keen to be a trading hub, and it seems that Singapore is running ahead of us. But for us, Korea has also our own merits. For example, we have a national gas grid, which can make a huge contribution to making us a Asian gas hub. Actually, a similar thing happened in the UK. They have their own gas hub called National Balancing Point, because thanks to their national grid, and we are looking into it. That case, but if any other countries like Japan or China develops their own national hub, it will be a good news for us too, because as long as we have liquidity in Asia and we have a kind of price marker in Asia, it will be beneficial to us. In my personal view, China has a potential, and their biggest problem is their regulation over the gas market, because they have very strong kind of restriction on the price. So if the Chinese government change their mind to raise their price or lower their price, they're going to be a huge investment problem for the foreign investors. But if they solve that kind of problem, for example, designating the Shanghai region for some kind of a waiver region of domestic regulation, we will see if it is successful. And Singapore, they have very liberalized economy, and they have good reputation hosting their oil hub in Asia. But the problem is it's just too small to be a hub.
Thank you. Is there any other question from the floor? I actually have one question for Graham. What is your view? You mentioned that possibly some of the LNG projects possibly cancel in the future, and you are a bit concerned on it. What's your view on future of natural gas, especially in Korea?
That's a really good question. I think the answer to that lays in history. And if you look back to the 1980s, and I think Vice Minister Moon raised this, and I think a couple of the other speakers did as well. that back in 1983, 84, when LNG contracts were first being mooted it heralded a whole new era for the Korean economy, and it heralded what has become known as the miracle on the Han. And so the future for natural gas, in my view, is very, very strong in South Korea. And again, as some other speakers have said, there is no silver bullet in any of this. And all of the different fuel sources are required. But what is needed is you need an energy policy that has a balance, and has a balance that factors in all of the fuel types and factors them in appropriately into the fuel mix. So I think if you look at history and you look at what natural gas has done for Korea, and you look at Korea's future path, I think you have to conclude that there is a long path ahead for natural gas in Korea, and all of the new technologies that are being talked about, a lot of those have natural gas that are implicit in them. Mm-hmm. So I think we'll be talking about LNG and natural gas in Korea for quite some time to come.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I have a question for Jun Kim, the Senior Vice President of Strategy of SK Energy, which is the largest energy company in Korea. You mentioned about condensate and the direction that you like to see in the future market. Do you see the demand growth of condensate in Korean market?
Last year, Korea imported 320,000 barrels per day, but in last third quarter, new read 245,000 barrels per day. New splitters was introduced in third quarter last year, and so I guess the total amount of condensate imported to Korea this year would be 500,000 barrels per day. And in 2017, newly 100,000 barrels per day new splitter will be introduced to Korea. So at that time, the demand for condensate will be 600,000 barrels per day. So up to 2 years later, then the demand for condensate of Korea would be doubled up.
Okay.
So it is very important how to get the costly and high quality condensate. Yeah, so I asked Mr. Baume to allow the condensate export to Korea.
Okay, thank you. Is there any question from the floor? Okay, I think it has been very long hours from 1 o'clock this afternoon, so I really appreciate the panel participants here. So would you please give applause to them?